not free market propaganda and corrupt politicians, cause they owned by special interest groups that fund their campaign. That's why you hear the same old things they claim, but change never came. It's a dirty game maintained by rain for capital gain, but my people getting tired of...
Welcome to the Project Censored show. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. A half a century has passed since the day the Ohio National Guard troops shot and killed 4 students, wounding 9 others at Kent State University. On this week's Project Censored show, we hear perspectives on the significance of Kent State today. We'll have excerpts from the over 4 hours of interviews I conducted recently with 8 people associated with Kent State. I interviewed academics, socio-political historians, protesters, massacre survivors, and others on issues related to May 4th, 1970, regarding the Kent and later Jackson State massacres. Tune in to the discussions as we explore never-before-discussed topics around May 4th, 1970 at Kent State University, what it means to all of us, then and now.
Bright with waves full of poison, genocide wars fought for little boys, and the weapons manufactured paid for by taxing while the bridges and the levees and the mines collapsing. All the prisons filled with capacity citizens, hypnotized by the master thief. Combine and conquer, steal a masterpiece. Open your eyes and realize what's happening. Time's running out, the reach all potential. Fame at the table, then you probably on the menu.
Welcome back to the Project Censored show. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. History matters. Today's program focuses on Kent State at 50, the 50th teach-in. At truthtribunal.org, we worked at Project Censored with Laurel Krause to conduct 8 interviews over 4 hours with socio-political historians, protesters, and massacre survivors on issues related to May 4, 1970, then and now. We hope these perspectives enrich your understanding of this important historical event and provide context for where we are as a society today, especially on matters of war and peace, civil and human rights, and how we can work together to create a more just and equitable world. On today's show, we share excerpts of these interviews, including with historian Peter Kuznick, who will be up first. He's the co-author with Oliver Stone of the Untold History of the United States. Peter Kuznick talks about the 1969 and 1970 period when President Richard Nixon escalated the Vietnam War into Cambodia, triggering intensified anti-war protests on U.S. college campuses. After Peter Kuznick, we'll hear from Joseph Lewis, who was a survivor of the Kent State shootings. He'll tell us about his memories of that day and media fabrications about it, and what lessons society ought to learn. After that, we'll hear from Laurel Krause, sister of Allison Krause, who was murdered at Kent State on that day. She'll talk about her family's long legal battle for accountability and wrap up with DeRay McKesson for a perspective from a member of a new generation of peace and justice activists. We spoke to DeRay McKesson from DeRay.com. DeRay is an activist noted for his work at Ferguson and beyond as part of Black Lives Matter. So on today's Project Censored show, the Kent State 50th Teach-In, we'll share these interview excerpts with you. Up next, Peter Kuznick.
We'd been living in a climate of violence for years around the Vietnam War, around the urban uprisings in the United States, around the increasing confrontations with the police and the military over and over again. I mean, that was really the world we lived in. There was a lot of violent repression of meetings, of conferences, of demonstrations. I mean, so the police were always a presence. And we always knew that the line between keeping order, in quotes, and overt violence was a pretty thin one here in the United States, not just overseas. So the news that the students had been shot and killed at Kent State was shocking to us, shocking to me personally. On one level, it could have been any of us at any time on any campus. There had already, I think even before that, been a student killed by the National Guard at Ohio State. There was later going to be the shooting of the African-American students at Jackson State on May 15th, early in the morning. So this was the climate of violence. But once you saw the images of the kids at Kent State lying there, we've been predicting for a long time that the violence that they were unleashing in Vietnam, in Cambodia, and Laos and elsewhere could also be visited upon us. So when Kent State happened, it was just the concretization, really, of the violence of the state that the American leaders were willing to unleash, not only in Vietnam, but also on Americans. You have to remember that how much killing was going on at the time. Robert McNamara came into my class a few years ago and said that he accepts the fact that 3.8 million Vietnamese died in the war. So any government that is willing to cause the deaths of 3.8 million Vietnamese and 1 million Laotians and Cambodians is not going to mourn the death of a handful of American students. For me, I knew that reality already because I was already radicalized. But for many others, this was really a wake-up call. And so on top of the reaction to the invasion of Cambodia, which was tearing the country apart already, then once this hit, the campuses exploded. The combination of the invasion of Cambodia, the bombing of North Vietnam again, and the killings at Kent State was really enough to create what many people at the time said was a civil war. The ruling class, the people in charge, the Kissingers and the others were very concerned about what was happening in American society, and they actively feared a rebellion, and that was the mood on campus. For example, I had been in Chicago in the summer of 1968 for the Democratic Convention. And what happened in Chicago, the commission that reviewed it afterwards, the Official Government Commission, said it was a police riot. And it certainly was a police riot. The Democratic Party had been identified as the party of the Vietnam War. There were some peace candidates we were supporting, but basically the Democratic Party apparatus then, like the Democratic Party leadership now, was center-right. So we were there to protest in the streets and in the parks and challenge the establishment. And they unleashed enormous amount of violence against us there. They not only clubbed and beat the protesters there, but they also beat the media. And so the press was also getting pulverized and pummeled by these thugs. And so they were much more sympathetic than they would have been. And some of it was captured on national television. So there was that kind of climate. So Kent State occurs a little bit later, but we knew that potential existed and was just beneath the surface. It was just being held beneath the surface. And we also knew what was happening to other groups. We saw the murder of the Panthers. We saw the COINTELPRO operations. We knew the repressive apparatus was there. So what happened with Kent State was tragic, but it wasn't shocking to us. But it did shock a lot of people who hadn't gotten to the point where some of us were. In 1969, there have been those major mobilizations. October 15th, the moratorium, millions participated in that. November 15th, the rally in Washington, D.C., at least 500,000 people participated in that. Huge anti-war march, the biggest up to that point ever. And so because of that, Nixon had to cancel his plans for Operation Duck Hook, which was going to be vicious, savage, he described it. And they even talked about using nuclear weapons there. But they had to cancel that. We didn't know it at the time, but they were obsessed with the anti-war movement. John Dean, Nixon's White House counsel, has come into my class quite a few times, and he tells my students that one of the things Nixon assigned him to do was to monitor the anti-war movement. He was obsessed with what we were doing. They changed their plans accordingly. So with Operation Duck Hook got canceled, and now he looks like, in his Vietnamization policy, he's going to pull U.S. troops out. Then Nixon goes on television, he makes his speech, he announces the incursion into Cambodia and the new bombing of North Vietnam. And the one who egged him on to doing this, to the incursion into Cambodia, the invasion of Cambodia, was Henry Kissinger, of course. So things break out immediately as there were demonstrations that very night that the invasion of Cambodia was announced. Then the next day, Nixon goes to the Pentagon and he gives this rallying cry, and he calls the protesters bums. And that day, the country went wild. That week, even before Kent State, there were far more than 100 strikes. There was a big meeting at Yale, and they called for a national student strike. So there were well over 100 campuses. Across the country, altogether, more than 500 campuses went out on strike or shut down for part of that week. What happened at Kent State is also very interesting because that first day, 500 students rallied at Kent State. They started fighting against the police who were sent in there to control them. They burned down the ROTC building. When the firefighters come to try to put out the fire, they cut the hoses. Then there's this confrontations, and the governor calls for a curfew first, and then he calls for sending in the National Guard. What he says about the students, this is Governor James Rhodes. So on the one hand, you've got Spiro Agnew, but then Rhodes was the worst of all. He says the anti-war protesters are worse than the Nazi brown shirts and the communist element and the night riders and the vigilantes. They are the worst type of people that we harbor in America. Then the National Guard comes in there. The Guard, they're told to keep their rifles locked and loaded, and then they open a fire. In 13 seconds, 61 shots are fired, 4 kids are killed, 9 wounded. It was a slaughter. Then even more hell breaks loose, and every campus just about in the United States is seeing tremendous protests, strikes, shutdowns. So there was this kind of activism in the air, and it continued, and it grew for the next week. And if you look at the reports from the President's Commission or from the quote unquote experts who were speaking at the time, they said that what we see is profound radicalization of students in the United States.
You're listening to the Project Censored show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. On today's show, the Kent State 50th Teach-In, we are looking at perspectives around the May 4, 1970 Kent State massacre. We will hear from Joseph Lewis, a survivor of the Kent State shootings, coming up next. Stay with us.
May 4th, 1970, the campus at Kent State had been occupied by 900 Ohio National Guardsmen. The rules were these. The campus was open as usual. Classes were going on, but the Ohio National Guard was going to enforce a limit of no more than 4 people could gather together on the campus at any one place. So this was an impossible situation. Friends of mine had been assaulted the night before, Sunday night, on the front campus when they violated the curfew, were told that they could speak with the president of the university and the mayor. But then at curfew time, the National Guard had surrounded them and bombarded them with tear gas and chased them with bayonets back onto campus. And there were several people who were injured that night. And so that combination and seeing students herded at bayonet point into their dorms on campus that night convinced me that I wanted to at least lend my presence to the opposition of the invasion and occupation of our campus by 900 National Guardsmen. And so the morning of May 4th, 1970, I went out and joined the crowd of students on the Commons as the victory bell rang in an effort to lend my body, my presence, to the statement that we don't want you here, these guardsmen. The guardsmen were lined up across the Commons with their gas masks, helmets, and bayonets and rifles. And the students were the whole field away from them on the hillside behind Taylor Hall. The guardsmen sent out the Jeep and told through a megaphone, they made the announcement, students of Kent State, this is an illegal assembly. Return to your dormitories. And it was absurd because, as I said, campus was open, classes as usual. I'd saved through my whole high school summertime work to be able to afford to go to school there. And if anyone was in the wrong place, the guardsmen were, because we were on the campus where we paid to attend. In fact, through the whole activities of Monday, I was never more than 50 yards from my room, which was at the end of Johnson Hall, very close to Taylor Hall. So I was never really where I shouldn't be. And I felt like we had the right to express our opposition to government policy in Vietnam and the occupation of the campus. And so Myself and others, we felt like we were free to express our First Amendment rights and our right to free assembly, and thought that we were doing that and within the law. And I admit there was, being 18, you have a sense of justice, I think, that tends to be modified as you get older and experienced. But I was still in that mode where I thought we should fight for liberty and justice for all. And so the guardsmen failed to have everybody leave when they told us to. And so they stepped forward, a handful of men stepped forward and fired tear gas across the space between the guardsmen and the students. And it was a macabre situation where students would cover their faces with a wet rag and throw the tear gas canisters back. And it was like a competition. There were cheers and there were boos, and that was also unsuccessful at dispersing the students. So then the guardsmen moved forward towards the crowd of students on the hillside across the field from them, and we dispersed in front of them. And I went between Taylor Hall and Johnson Hall, which was my dorm, and walked up the hill between them and then over to one side, allowing these guardsmen to pass between the buildings. And then they walked down the hill to the other side where they were on the practice football field. The students, and myself included, kind of reassembled on the hillside overlooking them from between the two buildings. When they got down there, they made an announcement over the bullhorn that, "Students of Kent State, we have you surrounded," which was really silly and ludicrous to hear, because from where I stood, the guardsmen were on a practice football field that had a cyclone fence on two sides of it, and then a hilltop covered with students on the other side. And so if anyone was surrounded, it appeared to be them. It didn't make any sense. They weren't executing any plan, it didn't look like. But they were getting harassed from the Prentice Hall parking lot. There were a few people throwing gravel. People say throwing rocks. They were throwing gravel. I actually told some guy, I said, don't throw rocks, because it was doing nothing but aggravating. I mean, there was no point to it. But they were getting harassed, and at that side of the field is where Alan Canfora, my blood brother now, was holding a black flag. And it was because just a couple of weeks before this, one of his friends from high school had been killed in Vietnam. But he held the black flag, and they knelt down at that end of the practice football field and aimed their rifles towards Alan and his flag and towards a vociferous group of students who were harassing them at that end of the field. And so that went on for a time. And then there was a huddle. A group of guardsmen met in the field. And I'm not sure what their conversation included, but I can attribute some nefarious kind of sentiment to them at that point. Because they got up, turned around, and began to retrace their steps back up the hill from where they had come, and coincidentally straight towards me. And many of us thought that, they were returning to where they had come, and that it was over, that they had done their best to disperse the crowd, and that they were returning to their starting point. So I was very near to them by coincidence when they turned and started to walk up the hill. And so I moved to one side. I was 18 and foolish, but not that foolish. When they started walking towards me with the bayonets, I moved over to the other side and just stood there. And I want to point out, silently and motionless, just kind of basically pivoting and watching them as they walked from my left to my right up the hill. And as they did, they were looking very sharply over their right shoulders back at the Prentice Hall parking lot area. This is, mind you, where the 4 kids who were killed were located. And so they walked up past me, and what I saw, and they got to the corner of the railing in front of Taylor Hall, the first 3 riflemen turned simultaneously. And I've always said that it was either by a previous agreement or by a command. And now at the time, I did not hear an order to fire. But there has been analysis of a audio recording that day that clearly shows what sounds like an order to fire by the guardsmen. So when they turned and aimed their rifles, first they aimed, and when they did, I was reflecting on the gesture on their practice field where they aimed their rifles for an extended period of time. And so I gestured back with my right hand, middle finger extended. The ground in front of me puffed up in little puffs of dirt. And this was the first moment I realized that the guns were loaded. At that moment, I was struck by a bullet that hit me in the right abdomen, just inside of my right hip, and then apparently glanced off something called the iliac bone and exited in where my left jeans pocket is, with an entry hole the size of a quarter and an exit hole the size of a Coke can. I was knocked to the ground. The gunfire lasted for 13 seconds. I was in a state of shock and surprisingly conscious. And so I fell to the ground, and in testimony in our civil trial in 1975, another individual who was then a member of the Ohio National Guard testified that he shot someone who was already shot writhing on the ground. And when our lawyers asked him why you would shoot a person who had already been shot, his flippant answer, knowing that he was going to be protected, I think, by the jury, was, well, everyone else was shooting him too. And so I got another wound in my lower left leg, just above the ankle. And these were steel jacketed 30 caliber rounds. That bullet through my lower left leg went between my two leg bones and didn't damage either one of them. So it had a quarter size entry wound, a quarter size exit wound between the two leg bones. And so for many reasons, I'm very lucky to be alive. And I have a load of guilt that I have to say I carry, because I was the closest person shot in a situation where the Ohio National Guardsmen said they were afraid for their lives. Now, anyone who was there, and I'm including all the National Guardsmen who were on that hill that day, they know that that's not true, because I was the closest person shot to them. I was silent and motionless, unarmed. I was giving them the finger, which I don't take a bunch of pride in, but to me, that's the biggest lesson to take from the Kent State shooting historically, is that it was a peaceful protest. None of the students did anything that deserved to be responded to in that way. And so after I was knocked to the ground and the gunfire ended after 13 seconds, there was a pause, a dead silent pause, and then screaming, and all hell chaos broke loose as students realized what had happened and realized what they had just witnessed. And a person came up to me from my left, a student, and I learned that I went to high school with his sister. And so he noted my ID and put my wallet in my coat pocket, because the pocket of my jeans had been blown off. I asked him, how bad is it? And he said, it's just a flesh wound, which I found reassuring, although it was far from the truth. And then from my right side, a young woman came up and held my hand, and I just squeezed the heck out of that girl's hand for however long she stayed with me. Then I started to think, I started having trouble breathing. And I started to think that, when you're 18, you don't have a lot of profundity developed. And so I was very flippant, even with this thought. I thought, this could be it. This could be the end of my life. But I have to say, I wasn't afraid. I felt a clear conscience and got loaded in the ambulance, two of us to the ambulance. I was in with John Cleary, who was shot in the lungs and suffering greatly. We eventually got to the hospital at Ravenna, Robinson Memorial Hospital. And it's really funny, the things that you remember in this exaggerated state of shock. We got there, and it must have been an orderly or somebody said, as we entered the emergency room, we're going to have to cut off your clothes. And I remember thinking, Mom's not going to like that. It's ridiculous the kind of way your brain works under these situations. But then I went into surgery. I got 6 pints of blood, and I think I was in surgery for like 6 hours. And the next 48 hours were 50-50, live or die. And I got the last rites in the hospital. And when I came to momentarily after about 2 days, and I remember I only was strong enough to say one thing, because I knew what my parents would think. This was a pre-Watergate time. And so the government was never doubted in those days. And so I just told my parents, I said, I didn't do anything wrong. Neither did anyone else who was there that day. So I was in the hospital for 3 weeks and a day. Dean Kaler on my right, paralyzed for life. John Cleary on my left with an impressive set of scars on his chest. We didn't know each other before, but we've since become, I call us blood brothers. We've become very tightly bonded, as well as meeting the parents of the 4 kids who were killed. That's one of the hardest things I've ever had to experience. They had read in the paper from Nixon, student demonstrators are bums. From the Ohio papers, they got what's coming to them. They should have shot them all. It was horrible. But we formed a tight-knit family, mostly through the 1975 civil trial. There were many efforts to try and obtain justice. The first judicial step came in October of 1970 with the Portage County grand jury. Now, this is Portage County, Ohio. And they had people come in and testify in secret in the grand jury setting, including students and guardsmen and professors. And when they were done, they had 25 indictments. 25 students and professors were indicted, and I was arrested. I was shot twice and arrested for misdemeanor participating with 4 or more others to block official action was my charge, second-degree riot. And so here I was, 18, naive and idealistic, recovering from my wounds, under arrest, thinking that everyone around us thought that we were the cause of what had happened, of the suffering and death that ensued. And so after 3 weeks and a day in the hospital, I was back at my parents' house in Massillon, Ohio, and the local paper came out with a story covering the Kent State shootings. And it said that students had attacked guardsmen with bricks and bottles and overturned cars and set them on fire, and not a word of that was true. Not any of that had happened in reality. And so I was just flabbergasted to think my neighbors, I was a kind of a goody-goody Catholic boy growing up, and I certainly didn't want them to think that that's what happened at Kent State. And so one of the lessons I've taken away is that you can't believe anything that the media or the government says.
What kind of impact do you think that this has had on our society then, and what does it mean now, do you think?
I hope that it caused attention to the evils and the wrongness of the war in Vietnam at the time. And people have suggested that it brought the war to a close sooner. And I hope that's true. I'm not a historian. Sadly, the collective hasn't learned a lot about protecting civil rights and dissent from public opinion. And we have to remember that people who disagree with us aren't our enemy. They're just people who we disagree with. I'm so appalled by the lack of leadership we have in our country now and the lack of compassion for people who are unlike us, the treatment of immigrants and refugees. We need to find our heart again. And we have not learned that lesson, I think, from the horrible incidents and pain of the past. But I think that's where we need to go. We need to welcome and treat refugees compassionately. We need to have our citizens' rights protected. A couple of the lessons from Kent State that I didn't really digest early on, but as I look back now, the National Guard were the ultimate militarized police force. Governor Rhodes called out the National Guard more than any governor in the country at the time, and it was like his own private army, but they were not trained for crowd control. The parallel experience nowadays is the militarization of urban police departments. This is not supposed to be an occupying force that controls the people. Government is supposed to protect the people, not keep them in their place. And I think that that policy needs to be widespread from the federal level to the local level, that the government is of, by, and for the people. It's for the people, not against the people. And I think that in the latest COVID-19 pandemic that we find ourselves in, the attitude that some on the federal level have is just that. It's opposed to the people's health and well-being, and it should be protecting that. As far as forgiveness, I found it personally helpful to forgive the two men who shot me, mostly because it was healthy for me, for my own well-being. And I also add that if they killed one of our four fellow students, I don't forgive them for that. That's not my place. I forgive them for shooting me. I don't tell them they're innocent of wrongdoing, but I forgive them for the wrong that they committed against me, partly because it's good for my own sensibilities, and partly because forgive those who trespass against us is part of my beliefs and has been forever. I do think that we need to grow our compassion. We need to understand people who aren't like us. We need to try and understand how people who with a different political point of view feel. But ultimately, we have to treat each other kindly. That's what I've tried to do. I always tell my kids, don't be fair, be generous. And I think that goes to forgiveness too. Let's be generous with our forgiveness. But I also would add that the whole anti-war aspect of that period of time has kind of been superseded by other interests. And I'm still an anti-war person. I'm not a pacifist, but I don't believe in wars of aggression. And I don't believe we fix things by flying our military to places far away and killing the people we find there. And I just want to say, like I tell students in the classrooms when I go to high schools or in colleges, I hope that in the future world that you control, you will allow for peaceful disagreement from government policies and peaceful protests in the streets.
10 soldiers and Nixon coming, we're finally on our own. This summer I hear the drumming, 4 dead in Ohio. Gotta get down to it, soldiers are cutting us down. Should have been done long ago. What if you knew her and found her dead on the ground? How can you run when you know?
You're listening to the Project Censored show. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. We're talking about the 50th anniversary of the Kent State Massacre. And up next, we have Laurel Krause. Her sister, Allison, was murdered at Kent State, May 4, 1970. And Laurel told me about her family's long legal battle for accountability and more. Here is Laurel Krause from the Kent State Truth Tribunal.
My sister, Allison, she was my older sister. She was 19, an honor student at Kent State. I was 15. I learned about it getting off the school bus, going home. At 15, when things like that happen, it changes your life forever. It also instilled in me a lifelong goal of finding truth at Kent State and fighting for my sister. That's what it meant to me. But it also meant a lot to my family. My parents took Kent State to the courts, and it was a very hard battle because the courts were very closed to seeking truth and accountability when it was matters related to the government. My father actually had to take it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court to get the right to sue the state of Ohio related to the killing of 4 and wounding of 9 at Kent State. And he won. Ohio was a sovereign state. And so my father's victory, my father, Arthur Krause, his victory was to be able to bring suit and ask for accountability from the governor and all the people in the state. They weren't above the law. And this changed the laws for all sovereign states across America, not just Ohio. So that was probably about the biggest thing we ever got out of our search for truth and accountability at Kent State. I've had the opportunity to take it to the United Nations in 2014. We're all interested in truth and accountability, especially when it's related to wrongful acts, massacre acts of the government. What we found when we were seeking truth and accountability at Kent State was that the government didn't want us seeking truth and accountability at Kent State, and they were doing everything in their power to stop us. For the 10 years following the Kent State massacre, when my father was suing the government, 9 years of litigation, ended up with $15,000 in a statement of regret. And it was a phony statement of regret on top of it, and the $15,000 was really more of a slap in the face. $15,000 for my sister's life. I mean, how ridiculous. But anyhow, we became targets of the government because we sought truth and accountability at Kent State. And Kent State seems to be an Achilles heel of government wrongdoings. It's blatantly obvious that the massacre was perpetrated by the government. My sister was killed by a government bullet. Let that sink in. A government bullet. And it's just never been about the Kent State story that the government did it. We're not allowed to, because the media is trained. Those who train the media, which my theory is these days it's the CIA, that's what they think their job is. And now they've perpetrated all the cable media with all these security analysts that are interpreting the news for us and all the defense people. Anyhow, we get the world through the TV and news. It's about war and propagating war and supporting war, and not about someone like my sister Allison, who stood for peace and actually protested against the war and got gunned down while she was protesting against the war. That's criminal. A government isn't allowed to kill a protester. No. And when they do, because they do, then they have to follow certain procedures. They have to do a higher level of credible investigation. None of that has happened in Kent State. We're not allowed that. They have to do certain actions to make amends. The opposite of that has been true. Just take a look at what's going on at the 50th. Not one word of amend, not one word of apology, not one word of, we shouldn't have done this. And 4 people died. And the other 9, that was attempted murder or target assassination, as they say at the United Nations. So how does it affect now? What happened to my family back then is we had them on our telephones. They were in our mailboxes. They were threatening us. We got threats in the mail from J. Edgar Hoover himself. They went to offering millions of dollars for us to get off of our lawsuits. And my father said, I'm not interested in money. We've never been interested in the money. It's not about the money. And that's the problem here, because in America, it's always about the money. Kent State is a perfect example for us to learn from. If we would ever take off the blinders and look at it as it is, where it was a government action perpetrated against protesters, we have to do things like what you do, Mickey, with Project Censored, just steadfastly demanding that we know the truth of these stories. And it's up to us. It's not up to the media, the paid media. They're paid off. Let's get real. Corporate owned. To make peace, we have to go for the truth. But we also have to teach it. We have to teach that it's really important and that truth matters. We don't do that. I recently had a session with Emerson College, and the students there were talking to me, and they were saying, wow, I never learned Kent State. These kids, they never heard about it. They never learned about it. And they looked at me, they said, did you know this? And I said, listen, I've lived it. I mean, this story has been censored since day one because it doesn't sit well. My sister said flowers are better than bullets the day before she was killed. The government doesn't like that story. And that is a big theme of the May 4th Kent State massacre. that my sister said that, and the next day that she was slaughtered by a bullet. I mean, that story is forgotten. It's conveniently forgotten by our government, by Kent State University, for those who want to foster this false narrative. And the false narrative, it stops us from healing. It stops us from ever dealing with the pain and coming to terms with it and making peace with it. You have to have truth in order to have peace. And finally, my personal goal here is for the protection of protesters today. Whatever happened to my sister and her friends and every other protester that has faced horrible government violence and death, this must never happen again in America. It is highly illegal for the US government to be killing protesters. We're coming into a difficult time now. I have worries. I'm concerned. We have to stop this. And the only way that we do that is everyone that's a protester has to understand that they have protester rights. This is a broadband issue. It's what connects us all. Let's connect together and let's begin our movement anew.
For dead in Ohio.
You're listening to the Project Censored show. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. As we wrap up today's program, looking at the 50th anniversary of the Kent State Massacre, we are reminded why history matters, and we hope these perspectives enrich your understanding of the important events that took place May 4, 1970 at Kent State, and thereafter at Jackson State as well. In this last segment, we share with you remarks from DeRay McKesson. It's a member of a new generation of peace and justice activists, going back to Ferguson, to Black Lives Matter. DeRay talked to us about why the lessons of Kent State still matter today.
When I think about Kent State, I remember learning about Kent State on a really surface level before I sort of dove into activism in this way. And it was 4 students get killed by the National Guard for pushing back against the government's intervention in Vietnam and a host of other social ills. And it made me think about 2 things. One is that when we think about like the long trajectory of civil rights, we've actually gotten a lot of wins. Housing, desegregation, education, health, like definitely not where we want to be, but a lot of wins. The police is actually one of the only institutions that is as bad or worse than when the fight started. So like National Guard isn't any more respectful of people's lives. The police aren't any more respectful of people. Like it is sort of the same. The numbers are the same. Like it is still sort of wild. Even when we think about this moment of COVID, it's like we just did analysis and the rate of police violence in March of 2020 is the same as it was in March of 2019. So even with the lockdown, shutdown, like the police behavior is largely unchanged. So when I think about Kent State, I think about what it means that we see young people rise up. We see young people take action. We see young people unarmed, only armed with the truth, standing in streets and saying like, this is unacceptable and being met with sheer violence, right? The second is I'm like just in awe of how something that happened in the 70s is essentially still happening today. That the violence of the police and the police apparatus is as consistent as anything we've ever seen.
You know, it's interesting that you say that. A couple of the other conversations I've had with people that were active at the time, they made those connections and saying that there's still a struggle, particularly around state violence. This is definitely a thread, a characteristic of our state, of our society, that we maybe haven't learned a lot of lessons from. So going back to Kent State, Jackson State, 50 years later, what, DeRay, could you say about the current political and human rights struggle that we are still dealing with?
I think that if there's any macro lesson I learned in the street in St. Louis and then in all the other places that followed, was that there's this myth of what it means to be an organizer. There's this myth, there's like a really academic understanding that says that the only people who organize are people who have read all the theory, they have been to 15 workshops, and it's like, let me tell you, when we were in the street in St. Louis, none of us were steeped in organizing theory, but you know, we often say that people have the experiences before they had the language. We knew what abolition was because we knew what it meant in our lives before we had the language of abolition. we knew what intersectionality was with our lives before we had the language of it. But there's a way that dominant culture even reinforces itself amongst marginalized communities that says that the only way to really be real, the only way to be validated is to have the language around these things. And if there's anything I've learned is that people have the innate skills to organize already. They do. People didn't need 15 workshops and 3 documentaries to be like, oh, the elderly person next to me probably needs some food, right? Like people didn't need the NAACP or any national organizing group to come to St. Louis and say, you know what, I think it's unacceptable that they not only kill Mike Brown, but left his body in the street for 4.5 hours. Like we didn't need critical essays about that to take action. So that's one, is that people have the skills. Part of our work as people who organize is to help people unlock those skills. The second is like, what does it mean to organize? Is that organizing at its root is always grounded in structural change, like systemic change. There are a lot of other things that are really good. Mobilizing, programming, activism, protest, all that is great. If it doesn't lead, if the end goal isn't some structural change, then like it's not organizing. And that's not like a bad thing. It just is like is what it is, right? The third thing is that when I think about the police, one of the things that we realized in 2015 was that if we focus on these singular moments of trauma, we'll never win. Because the worst or like the most intense consequence that'll come out of a singular moment of trauma will be accountability for the officer. That is sort of like the thing that happens with the police. There's some other things that like, you know, we get one missing white kid and then all of a sudden we have a whole Amber Alert, right? But like with the police, because the police normally terrorize people of color, it's like one just never is like enough to change the landscape. And, you know, it's this push about how do we make sure that we don't let people confuse accountability and justice? That accountability is what happens after the trauma. Justice is the idea that the trauma shouldn't exist in the first place, right? It's why we double down on so much of the data and understanding the rules and understanding the policies and laws, because we were like, yeah, we could totally stand in the street again when somebody gets killed, but like we've just that's never changed the structure, right? Like that, it just hasn't. And that's something that I'm always mindful of. The last thing I'll say is that since the protests in 2014, the police have killed more people, not less. Didn't get better, got worse. The only bright spot is that there's actually been a statistically significant decrease in cities. It's been an increase everywhere else. But the places that have had a decrease, there's been structural change. Like that is like what has happened. It wasn't random. There's been like sustained pressure that either we moved out a set of leaders or we changed some rules and policies, but something at the structural level happened that made this possible.
You know, at Project Censored, we cover a lot of stories that folks in certain communities, certainly marginalized communities, may be aware of, as you said, through lived experiences. But the corporate media don't give them any kind of frame or a platform. They either ignore these stories or they tend to frame or flip them around and tell a very backwards or very distorted kind of story versus the one that you literally see on the ground when you're living those experiences. And so history matters, and we need to learn a lot of the lessons from the 1960s and 70s. It seems 50 years later, here we still are in the midst of an empire, military excursions abroad, more and more violence at home. So in some senses, that feedback loop has continued. And you mentioned reform or structural changes that have diminished police violence. And then at the same token, 50 years later, after COINTELPRO, we still have the FBI targeting part of the Black Lives Matter movement. So in a lot of ways, the overarching system on the federal level really hasn't changed, but on the local level, maybe it has. DeRay, could you talk at all about a couple of the instances, the really good news stories where you've seen some of these kinds of changes or reforms or civilian oversight committees?
We did some work in Austin with the organizers in Austin who are incredible. And they were working really hard on changing some aspects of the police union contract. So in Austin, there was like this rule that there was a very small window from when an officer did something to you when you could report it. And that was like the thing that they used to organize. And they pushed and pushed. And eventually, you know, we were there that night. The city council unanimously voted against the police union contract, which had never, ever happened in Austin. The organizers got a seat at the table when it came to actually negotiating. So it's like you saw all of a sudden, it wasn't momentary, but they were like, how do we actually insert ourselves into the way the rules are mapped out? Same thing's actually happening in Portland right now, which is really powerful. Oakland had some really aggressive changes to the way the police can use force in communities. And again, this is not to say that the police in these communities aren't still wreaking havoc in many ways, but it is to say that when we think about police violence, normally when people say police violence, they think about violence that results in death, right? Partly because that is like where the best data is. So we know that sexual assault is happening. We know that verbal assault, we know that a host of other things are happening, and we never are diminishing those. We just don't have a lot of data on those. So we can't like quantify it in the way that we can quantify death. So in places like Oakland, police violence that results in death is just down. It's dramatically down. This doesn't mean that there aren't other forms of police violence that are actually really prevalent in community, but we have focused so heavily on like keeping people alive. We also track a lot of rules and policies around the country, and you'd be shocked at how many people are afraid of sort of addressing the police. So like California has a law that says that any investigation of an officer that lasts more than a year can never result in discipline regardless of the outcome. That is wild, right? And a lot of people don't know that. And you know, who controls the investigations? The police. So if they want to ride it out, make it a year and a day, a year and 2 days, like they automatically kill the investigation. You can love the police and that doesn't make sense, right? In Oregon, the law says that an officer can use deadly force if they think you just committed a felony or if they think you're about to commit a felony. What? We spend a lot of time in communities, even with lawmakers, and like deciphering what the rule is, you know?
I think it's really good that you point that out. You're here in Northern California, Santa Rosa. I'm sure you're familiar with the shooting of the 13-year-old Andy there several years ago, and it led to some movements to try to get oversight in the police commission. The community's been very resistant. Certainly the police force been very resistant. I'm glad that you pointed out that a lot of folks in society don't really know the rules by which the police investigate themselves. And so when the sheriff comes out and says that officer so-and-so didn't commit any wrongful act, to observers from the outside, it just looks completely venal and corrupt. But when you actually go in and look at what their own guidelines and rules are, they're technically correct by the way that they enforce their own rules. And that's something that more people really need to understand in order to affect change. Would you say that's true?
Absolutely. And, you know, I know way more about, I'm an expert on the police now in a way that I was not before. And you'd be shocked. There are things like, you know, what do you think it means when the police say they solved a case? What do you think that means? Like, what are the actions that go into solve?
Well, it sounds like that they've come to some resolution or they've figured something out and made a determination about it.
So in every city across the country, solve just means that they made at least one arrest.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that they arrested the right person. Doesn't mean that it was a conviction. Right. So there's so much about the policing apparatus that people like really don't know. So like I will hear, oh, the police solve crimes, they keep communities safe. Even the metric that they use is really low, right? Like in a lot of major cities, the solve rate is like 30%, which means that they didn't even think they found somebody for the majority of the cases. And they don't even track conviction data because that is so low, right? So like, it's actually not happening in the way people think it's happening. So that's a part of it. The second is that, and you talk about the reason that stories matter, is that so much of this is like not only helping people understand the structure, like the way sort of rules and policies work, but also the structure of the way we've been conditioned to think about these apparatus. So like, you know, I'll ask people to tell me a place where you feel the most safe. Like just think, you don't have to tell me, but think of a place where you feel safe, where you feel the most safe. You got it? Are the police there?
No, they're nowhere near.
Yeah. So when we think about what safety means, we are saying, how about we get all the things that were in that place where you felt safe? That's what everybody deserves. That place that you got in your mind that was safe for you was probably a place where there was food, shelter, family, people who love you. That is what makes community safe. It's not the presence of the police. The police at their best normally get there after the bad things already happened, right? We want to create a world where the bad things don't happen.
Well, that's an incredible vision. And certainly looking back at our history, we really need to learn those lessons. Do you have any parting advice for us, for our listeners, as we're looking back 50 years of what happened at Kent State, Jackson State? We've got a lot of work cut out for us. You shared a lot of your wisdom with your book from a couple of years back. If people aren't familiar with that, they could certainly learn a lot from your work. Your book was On the Other Side of Freedom.
I think the only lesson I'll say is I'm always mindful of who becomes a casualty of these situations. It's always the people with the least amount of power. It's students who are just like outside. It's the poorest people who are in the street, who their bodies are used as disposable things by the state in ways that we know are unacceptable, but I'm also shocked at how quickly people forget. So part of my work is to keep things alive. Like I even think about Ferguson, we were all alive for that. It was not too long ago. And the number of people who don't remember us being in the street for 400 days is still wild to me. People talk to us like we were in the street for like 2 weekends. It's like, it was a long 400 days. And I never want people to forget like the cost of it. And I will hear people say things like, oh, I just couldn't come, I couldn't make it. And it's like, neither could we. All of us sacrificed something. It was easier for all of us to stay home. So I'm not really interested in like you telling me you couldn't come. What is true is you didn't come. And I'm okay with that. But don't make it sound like you had way more to lose than everybody else and therefore you didn't. And I think about all the young people at Kent State, Jackson, all these people who like, it would have been so much easier for them to stay home, to stay in the dorm, to go home, to phone it in, and they chose not to. And part of our work is to always honor that. Like honor the people who in the moment where they had to make a tough decision, they made it. They didn't like explain it away. They didn't rationalize. They made the choice, and I'll always stand by people who make the choice.
Well, DeRay McKesson, thanks so much for your advice, for sharing your thoughts, and thanks so much for your activism. It's actually just part of your everyday existence, part of your life. And I think if all of us take that advice that you just gave and show up and be part of those things that happen, we can make more of those larger structural changes that we're still looking for. So thanks so much for your time and your work, DeRay.
We want to smash, crash, mash, blast the system. We want to get it hype, get it live, get with the mission. We want the crowd loud, fist pumping, rhythm is hitting. We want to make it clear, we ain't scared. This is the vision. We want a liberated land, supporting human conditions, not free market propaganda and corrupt politicians. Cause they own by special interest groups that fund their campaign. That's why you hear the same old things they claim, but change never came.
You've been listening to the Project Censored show, highlighting today our Kent State teach-in. You can learn more about these interviews at projectcensored.org and truthtribunal.org. You've been listening to the Project Censored show. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. I co-founded the program with Peter Phillips in 2010 at KPFA in Berkeley, California, 94.1 FM, kpfa.org. This program is syndicated on Pacifica Radio across the country. Our producer is Anthony Fest. Our associate producer is Dennis Murphy. To learn more about the Project Censored show, go to projectcensored.org. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Please feel free to contact us through projectcensored.org about program ideas or feedback. Last but not least, we are grateful for all of you, our listeners, and we hope you're staying well in our trying times.
The ocean burned bright with waves full of poison. Genocide wars fought for little boys, and the weapons manufactured paid for by taxes while the bridges and the levees and the mines collapsing. All the prisons build the capacity citizens, hypnotized by the master thief. Divide and conquer, steal a masterpiece. Open your eyes and realize what's happening. Time's running out to reach our potential. If you ain't at the table, then you're probably on the menu. We got that love.